Jesi milostivi čovekoljubi Bog i tebi slavu uznosimo, Otcu i Sinu i Svetome Duhu, sada i u vekove vekova.
In a world of shadows and secrets untold, where primeval stories make the brave go cold, mighty gods on high and realms below, whispers of legends that shape each soul. And nightmarish dreams, cryptids lurking, nothing's as it seems. Giants walking, angels and demons fight. Only truth can bring the light. Through to the echoes of time, the tales unfold. Mysteries arise as the prophecies are foretold. From valiant knights to buried treasure, this podcast brings nothing but pleasure. Welcome to myths, mysteries and majesty. Study with us, don't be a travesty. Theology, mythology, fantasy and horror. Dungeons and dragons, Skyrim and Mordor. And Mordor, the powers haunt the evening. In gothic castles where they're screaming. Wizards cast spells in their towers tonight, exploiting enigmas hidden from our sight. Archaeologists make excavations deep on the ancient tombs where pharaohs sleep. In the dust of ages we chronicles keep, storytelling's power of monsters that creep. Myths, mysteries and majesty is the place for you to learn about this haunted space. From scholarship to manuscripts of old, unlock the secrets of wisdom and gold.
Historians have a very difficult job whenever they're assessing either biblical manuscripts or when they're assessing some stories from the past. If there's so-called discrepancies within the manuscripts or maybe in the oral tradition. So the problem that historians have, which can be a bittersweet problem, is like, hey, we have these stories and we have different and multiple sources, but the problem is how to go back to the origin of the story and find out what was the core of that story and what was later added on that. So welcome to episode 136 with who else but my dear friend and brother in Christ, Saint Shaun, who is the co-host of the channel. We'll be talking about this phenomenal book and phenomenal author who is not a Christian. The book is called Phantom Armies of the Night, the Wild Hunt, and the Ghostly Processions of the Undead. His name is Claude Lacoteau, I think that's how it's pronounced. He was a French professor of medieval literature and civilization at the Sorbonne. He's the author of numerous books on medieval and pagan afterlife beliefs, including The Return of the Dead, The Secret History of the Vampires, and the Witches, Werewolves, and Fairies. He lives in Paris. So even though his passion was compiling the medieval eyewitness reports of supernatural events and stories, he's not one of those charlatans. His heart was to be a scholar and in a scholarly level to compile and assess these stories. And because the book has so many events and so many info, we'll be probably covering this for at least 2 Fridays. Shaun, from your experience when it comes to this book and this author, that I would think you didn't read about anything from him either. How cool are these stories, and how important are these things for us to read as Christians? Because someone will be thinking like, hey, are you talking about ghosts, spirits, phantoms? Are you talking about like the one who may be coming from dead or hunting? Maybe tell me about these stories that people all will tell kids to, make them scared if they don't go to bed like on time, and stuff we tell today to, our kids in some change form. But actually, no, like it is a scholarly book by a scholarly author. So what is your overall impression, and what is your encouragement to the audience? Why should they be reading stuff like this?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on this. First is it one of the things that the author does is links stories that existed in more ancient times with accounts that have been had in the medieval and even some of the early modern period. And so, one of the important things it does is establish a chain of custody for this idea, how it travels and changes through time, and even how maybe we get some of our own presuppositions about the spirit world that are given to us through tradition. Um, so, I think the first important thing is that it shows how our Christian lineage draws on earlier traditions to explain what's going on cosmologically. Um, Second, the reason that I think it's important is because these people were devout Christians, and yet they had room for this in their worldview. That's not saying that I espouse everything that that he's recording in this book, and it's not saying that I don't think that people sometimes made things up or stuff of that nature. But what it does do is it allows us to examine our Christian worldview and look at other Christians who had, I don't even want to say borrowed. I was going to say borrowed some of the more ancient traditions, but they didn't borrow it because it was theirs to draw from. So I think it's like a well of water, like a bucket of water in a well rising up to us. We kind of get to see all the stages that water went through, from the most ancient stories down at the bottom to how it arrives to us and what it goes through. And for me, this was just really interesting.
Yeah, that was beautiful. I wouldn't be able to put it in those words. So thank you so much. That served as a phenomenal introduction to the tonight's episode. And like I said, we'll be covering only several chapters because every chapter has tons of stories and data that will be impossible to cover everything within a few hours. So let's start by reading. I'll read just the first chapter from the back of the story, and then we'll go at the first chapter. He said this, the author: once upon a time, a phenomenon existed in medieval Europe that continuously fueled local lore. During the long winter nights, a strange and unknown troop could be heard passing outside over the land or through the air. Anyone caught by surprise in the open fields or depths of the woods would see a bizarre procession of demons, giants, hounds, ladies of the night, soldiers, and knights, some covered in blood and others carrying their heads beneath their arms. This was what the wild or infernal hunt, the host of the damned, the phantom army of the night, a theme that still inspires poets, writers, and painters to this day, was there. Millennia older than Christianity, this pagan belief was employed by the church to spread their doctrine, with the shapeshifters and giants of the pagan nightly processions becoming sinners led by demons seeking our unwary souls to add to their wretchedness. I don't know how to pronounce that. Myth or legend, it represents a belief that it has deep roots in Europe, particularly Celtic and Scandinavian countries. So I just want to say that the author, you can tell clearly that he's not a Christian, which doesn't mean he's a bad scholar or anything. But throughout reading this book, he'll be occasionally upset. And he said, hey, this story or this tradition was heavily influenced by the medieval church and changed and altered, but actually all of these stories have actually pagan roots. And then later monks would see the same stories and say, hey, this was a demon or this was the devil. And I was partially on his side. I was like, yeah, I understand you, like, but on the other side, we tend to contextualize everything. Like if you go to Asian churches, Jesus is Asian. If I mean, didn't the apostles and the prophets do this? They were like, hey, it's not Baal who's the rider on the clouds, it's Yahweh. Or they were like, hey, this actually, God who you're serving, or, they're actually demons. So if we give the proper name or title to a spiritual entity behind the older story or the narrative, in that sense, we don't contextualize it necessarily, but even if we do, it's not a sin or something bad that we're doing by giving proper names to our best abilities. True, the church should not call everything a demon or whatever. Like, we can demonize everything nowadays. So I do understand him partially. Him for his passion as a scholar to compile the stories in their original shape and form, which is almost impossible because they've been altered through the evolution of oral tradition, all these centuries. But on the other side, I also have to stand with the church and say, hey, because we'll read a lot of priests and monks telling these stories, sometimes even through in their sermons. I just have to say that if priests and monks, their best ability, would say, hey, these stories, you should not go and do what the pagans did. And if they'll call the entity maybe not a phantom, but a demon or the devil, I wouldn't see it necessarily as bad. They will try to use the lingo that is familiar with the regular churchgoer, with the Christian, with the Bible, so the Christians can understand. They don't have to know, hey, this word in German or French, because the story origin is there, it's actually pronounced this. They need to know it's a spiritual entity and it's not of God. So I just want to say there's this division of me when I was reading. I was like, yeah, I understand the scholar, but on the other side, I also understand the priests. So we'll be reading some stories and, getting to some eyewitness accounts when it comes to the 7 stories. The first one is called, hey, Joshua, and hey, Amber. The first one is called The Good Women Who Roam the Night. And as we will see, there's nothing good about them. And now I feel like a Calvinist, but seriously, there's nothing good about these spirits of the night. Certain nights play host to the passage of all kinds of nocturnal troops. These legions were sometimes composed of the living, led by Diana and Herodias, Seisha, and Dame Abandi, or alleged witches whose doubles had quieted their sleeping bodies. Sometimes they gathered the dead, revenants, or damned souls who could find no rest. Finally, demons or the devil in person and his minions could be seen walking or riding in the darkness. We encounter the first instance of the belief in the ladies of the night, in a canon attributed to the Council of Ancyra, which met in 314 AD. Yet this canon first known appearance was in 872 in the Capitularies of Charles the Bold. It was picked up anew in 899 in a treatise by Regino, the abbot of Prum, who said this. This also is not to be omitted, that certain wicked women turn back to Satan, seduced by demons, by demonic illusions and phantasms, believe of themselves and profess to ride upon certain beasts in the nighttime hours with Diana, the goddess of the pagan, or Herodias, and then innumerable multitudes of women, and to traverse great spaces of the earth in the silence of the dead of night, and to be subject to her laws as of a lady, and on fixed nights be called to her service. This text, known as the Canon Episcopi, inserted around 1066 by Burchard of Worms in his Decretum, offers evidence that the church attacked an allegedly pagan belief that was still vigorous enough to be viewed as dangerous. Have you believed, with many women turning back to Satan, believe and affirm to be true, as you imagine in the silence of the night, where you have gone to bed and your husband lies in your bosom, that while you are in a bodily form, you can go out by closed doors and are able to cross the spaces of the world with others deceived by the like error, and without visible weapons slay persons who have been baptized and redeemed by the blood of Christ. Burchard records here a belief that is the source of the witches' Sabbath. Certain women possess the ability to propel flesh and blood doubles of themselves to roam for great distances, committing evil deeds, killing people, eating them, placing pieces of wood or straw in the place of their hearts and then reanimating them. He goes on more explicitly and says, have you believed a certain women are accustomed to believe, to wit, that by virtue of other limbs provided you by the devil, you have crossed in the silence of the quiet night through closed doors to fly into the clouds where you have waged battle on theirs, both inflicting and receiving wounds. And I'll stop here. So, Shaun, from the get go, in the very first chapter, which is, I wish it's sarcasm, but it's honestly titled The Good Women Who Roam the Night. And you have the book, so you know that. From the very get go, we see that there's nothing good about these ladies. And we see, even if Christians want to contextualize these pagan sources, say, hey, these entities, you can call them ladies of the night, but look what they're doing. They can project their spirits. They can they scare people. They can reanimate, the corpses of people. Supposedly, right? We weren't there to testify of these things. There's nothing good about them. So maybe we can start by saying this. What is your opinion? Does the church, the global church, does the church have the right to contextualize and understand or change the stories in the way like, hey, this entity is actually the devil or a demon, so be aware, use this spiritual warfare to fight back.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I think the reason that they call them the good women is because, especially in the Celtic lands that you were talking about, they have a tradition of calling the Fae there the good folk or the good people. And so I think it is a title that they give to someone to not tick them off. So I don't think it actually means morally good, because they were not very friendly with the fairies, which, as we know as Christians, are very closely related, if not the same thing as demons. Secondly, the church reserves the right to interpret any phenomenon in the light of the truth. So it doesn't matter how it comes down to us. We have the right to unpack it and see, okay, there are elements of this that are maybe phenomenologically true, but we have the ability now to read it morally rightly, and it turns out that these things are actually evil. We do that well with the ancient pagan gods. When we see, the shenanigans of someone like Zeus, and then we can rightly say, oh yeah, that totally is a thing, but it's a fallen angel, and its character is consistent with that of a fallen angel. So 100%, as a church, we reserve the right to pass moral judgment on anything that comes to us, without dismissing the phenomena as not being real.
Hey, I agree. Thank you for that. We switch to the next page, and the author is now getting a little bit upset with the stories, how they were altered. So we can read a small portion of that. He's now quoting another medieval church quotation, and this is the quotation: "Have you believed that there is any woman who can do that which some, deceived by the devil, affirm that they must do of necessity or by his command, to wit, with a host of devils transformed into the likeness of women? She who common folly calls Holda, Holda, must ride on certain beasts during special nights and be counted as members on the company of demons." So now this is the book author. I forgot his name, Claude Lecutu. This is now his comment. He says, Burchard does not understand the phenomenon of a split personality and attributes that to a necessity or a command. In fact, it is a gift, an atavism. According to the beliefs of earlier times, every human being possessed several souls. I honestly did not know this. And in this instance, the word soul means just vital principle. Among these souls, there is the external soul, which the ancient Scandinavians called the HMR, Hamr, in which Latin text refer to animus or spiritus. This soul is able to quit the body when it is sleeping in a coma or in a trance or is afflicted by serious illness. It can then go about in the form of an animal or human. The clerics were unable to grasp this, observing only that the body was still present before their eyes, and they attributed the stories of people whose double has rejoined their bodies to a trick of the devil. Okay. So now he's getting a little bit feisty and spicy, and I understand that. Okay, let's say the clerics and the clergy of that time were ignorant. Like we're all ignorant about that, about something, right? I mean, after all, this was long, long ago. Fine, I'm okay with that. How, I don't even know what the word normal means nowadays when everything is upside down. But let's say normal is still meaning something that most of us can agree what is normal. How normal, Shaun, would it be that someone can just go to sleep and leave their body, travel but at will, uh, and their double, which we'll say maybe nowadays doppelganger, but this was translated as the double with capital D, can travel the world, go somewhere, do something. If we notice any instance like this in the Bible, it will be usually when the Spirit of God would come to usually a prophet or a disciple, like for example to John or Paul, and will take their spirit, and it will be by God's command that God will bring them to the third heaven or give them supernatural revelation, things of that sort. It wouldn't be you're just flying and doing astral projection from your own body, from your own bedroom at will. I've read and heard a number of testimonies, especially people who used to do it and stopped, and they many times or sometimes they will witness that they will be observed by these demonic entities that sometimes they will look like aliens, and they will be so scared and like, I should not be doing this astral projection anymore. So okay, so the author is upset here how the monks were illiterate or maybe not literate enough. They did not know psychology of the soul or of the person. Fine, but still, okay, we lost Shaun for a second. Okay, we lost you for a second, but still, how normal would be this, the whole ability to transform yourself into the spirit realm, go and travel, and come back. This doesn't sound very biblical.
No, the only thing I can think of in scripture where we see maybe evidence of somebody's double traveling outside of their body is when Peter was in prison and the angel freed him. And then he's there knocking on the door as they're in the house praying for him. And the servant said, "Hey, Peter's here." And they responded, "Oh, it's just his angel." Well, I maybe I'm just ignorant, but I didn't know that your angel looks exactly like you. But if by this they're kind of pointing to a tradition in which a person's double can travel outside of their body, but then that makes me curious as to why they weren't concerned enough to get up and go to the door. Like, oh yeah, it's just a phantom there at the door that's knocking. Like, just disregard. That doesn't make much sense to me. But the ability for someone to travel outside of their body is well attested to. We call that astral projection, and in most cases, uh, it is something that is allowed through demonic power, for someone to be able to travel and see things outside of their body. And I think Bankars has he has a testimony regarding this phenomenon where he was actually pulled out of his body and tried to get back in, and the demon kept trying to pull him out of his body. And so, yeah, astral projection, totally a thing. Be aware of it. Be scared of it. You don't want something else taking over your body. But as far as there being existence of a double in the Bible, I only can really think of that one account. But we do have, even to this day, we have modern testimony of things like doppelgangers. So maybe that's less of a person traveling outside of their body and influencing things, and more a shapeshifter taking on that form. Because in every instance of a doppelganger I can think of, it's always nefarious.
Yeah, and then the author is dealing with the goddess Diana and Herodias. She said this Diana is certainly not the same as the Roman goddess Diana. And we're going to skip the portion of Herodias. We cannot certainly read everything, but I just want to read this segment where he explains actually the belief and the customs of those times. He said, the author, the night was then divided into 7 parts, and every part has a weird Latin word I won't even try to pronounce. But then he said, only the middle of the night, which was called Canticinium, which is probably not correct, was propitious to the magic journey. And I think this is interesting for us. So only the middle of the night was suitable for the magic journey. This was also the most favorable time for apparitions, because it was the time men no longer spoke and the roosters were not yet crowing. So this deity that had different names, such as Feraldis or Herodias, gathered her companies during the 3rd part of the night, rested during the 4th, and returned the women to their homes at the rooster's crow. It is common knowledge that the crowing of the rooster sends the spirits of the night fleeing. The first warning is given by a white rooster, the second by a red one. By the time the black rooster crows, all the spirits have vanished. I mean, the only thing that I know about this is when it comes to vampires. It's right that's the folk tale, the lore that it comes to vampires. I didn't know anything that has to do with the wild hunt and with the phantoms or witches and the stories of the roosters. I was just interested if you know any comparison when it comes to the roosters. We can't even go to the Bible except to that part when Peter was denying Jesus and he was waiting for, he was told that, the rooster will go on 3 times. And when the prophecy, happened, we know that Peter went and bitterly wept, and then he repented for betraying Jesus. But that's not this. So this is why I'm wondering, if you know any similarity between the lore of vampires and phantoms and ladies of the night and anything when it comes to medieval lore.
Well, I mean, if we just take that one instance of Peter denying Christ, you have the guards detaining Christ, them moving in a procession, and you have the followers of Christ that are at a distance following and are so miserable that Peter actually ends up denying Christ. So perhaps what the author was doing when writing this is relating it to this earlier tradition of there being like basically saying this is how terrible this event was. It was like the procession of the dead. And as far as the 3rd hour or the 3rd watch of the night, or I do know that the most common time for people to die is between 2 and 5 a.m., which would be at 5 a.m. you still have an hour or 2 before sun rises. So that might be that 4th period of time that they're talking about, where then the procession rests. And I wonder if it has anything to do with the observance of that phenomenon, that, well, there must be something happening because all these people are dying at this period of time. And it actually has to do with your sleep cycles. And at that period of time, your breathing and your blood pressure are at their lowest. And so that's when it's most advantageous for your body to just shut down.
Cool. We're now switching to the Feast of the Ladies of the Night. In his De Universo, the Bishop of Paris, William of, I won't even try to pronounce this place, but Bishop William of Paris indulges in a sharp critique of the pagan rites and beliefs that were widespread in his country, and of course, he too speaks of nocturnal hosts. And this is his lengthy quotation. The same is true of the spirit that, under the guise of a woman who, in the company of others, visits homes and services at night. She's named Seisha from satiety or satiety. I don't know how to pronounce this word. And also Dame Abundant. That's her second name. Because of the abundance she bestows upon the dwelling places she visits. It is this very kind of spirit that the old women call the ladies, and in regard to whom they maintain this error to which they alone give credence, even in delusional dreams. They say that these ladies consume the food and drink they find in homes without consuming them entirely, not even reduce their quantity, especially if the dishes holding food are left uncovered and the containers holding drink are left uncorked when left out for the night. But if they find these containers covered or closed or corked, they will not touch either food or drink. And this is the reason why the ladies abandon these houses to vow and ill fortunes without bestowing either satiety or abundance upon them. The feast of the ladies of the night is also, that was the end quote. The feast of the ladies of the night is also vouched for on the eastern side of the Rhine. That's the place Rhine. But the leader of the host here is called Perched or Perchta, I guess, if it's a female. We have here another religious figure called Berthold of Regensburg, who lived in the 13th century and who violently condemned the beliefs of the Bavarians and condemned his flock in a Latin sermon. And this is a quotation from his sermon. You should not believe at all in the people who wander at night and their fellows, no more than the benevolent ones and the malevolent ones, or in fairies, or in nightmares, or of both sexes, in the ladies of the night, in nocturnal spirits, or those who travel by riding this or that. They're all demons. Nor should you prepare the table anymore for the blessed ladies. And I'll say, amen. Even if he would mess up the structure of the demonic realm, he's still giving us very sound biblical advice. You should not prepare the feast for these devils because you serve Christ, right? So he says, nor should you prepare the table anymore for the blessed ladies. I would assume this is the sermon for those who were pagans and they converted to Christianity but kept some of the customs. The same thing was happening in my country. Christians would convert but would still, even to this day, keep some of the pagan beliefs. This last sentence is explained by in another sermon, and it's only one sentence. The foolish peasant women indeed believe that the ladies of the night and night walking spirits visit their homes and they are set a table for them. In German-speaking countries, this deity or spirit, Percht, is the equivalent of Abundia and Seisha. Their identical nature was clearly established by Thomas von Hasselbach in 15th century, who was a professor of theology at the University of Vienna and who provided other names for these nocturnal visitors, such as Habundia, Finzen, Sexemper, and Secria. Okay, I'll stop here. Shaun, this is like a cruel, dark imitation of the Lord's Supper. The same way we have, and we'll soon, I think, mention this, a twisted version of the Mass. Here we see a twisted version of the Eucharist, of Lord's Supper. What type of belief would you have to have? What type of pagan roots would you have to share with your ancestors to think that these spirits, these feminine spirits, would come in your house and feast or drink on whatever you left that is open, not closed? And if they're pleased with that, they would leave blessings. And by doing that, you can actually feed these spirits, which is basically impossible unless these spirits can, for sure, short time, they can be embodied. What is it, when it comes to you and this segment that we just read, that you think it's so morbid, but yet important for the audience to mention?
Yeah, in in Germany, as well as some of the other countries in Northwest Europe, um, there were traditions of leaving out offerings for spirits or creatures that would bring blessings onto your house. Um, there was even an idea that there was like a house god that was a spirit. Sorry, I got dropped. There was an idea of like a house god that conducted all the business of the house. And this was not only very common, but there were also bishops that were writing against the ideas of these things, saying that it's really easy to get the people to stop believing in like what we think of as like the Germanic gods like Odin and Thor. That was simple. What was hard was to get them to stop doing all of these smaller things because it was such a big part of their everyday life. Um, the leaving out of food for these things, normally it would be like porridge or cream and honey or something like that. This is essentially setting up an altar to a false god. And Paul says that you cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. And so they're leaving something out as an offering, expecting a blessing from it. This is the definition of sacrifice. And so it doesn't matter how small the sacrifice is. The fact that it is a sacrifice. And obviously, I think Bishop William, who you were talking about, who was reading about this, was very clear on what the Bible says. And he's like, nah, you guys can't be doing this. You are having communion with demons. This needs to stop. You have one God, and it doesn't matter what your prior beliefs about these things were or what possible blessings they can offer you. You are now owned and claimed by the one living God. So any blessings that you think you're going to get from them, you're going to get much more from him. And anything that you possibly think they could do to you by not setting out the blessings, I promise you greater judgment is coming from the true and living God if you continue to do these things.
Indeed. So now the author continues paralleling these stories with, with the folklore of other European nations. He goes to the Valkyries, he goes to elves, he goes to different sorts. But I just want to read this short account, which is it's so bloody, it's so morbid, but it's important for us. So there's this story or a poem, I don't know. It's called The Lay of the Lance, transmitted by the saga of Burnt Angel, Njal, relates an event that takes place on the eve of the Battle of Clontarf, which was in 1014, so the very beginning of the 11th century. The Irish king Brian perishes, and this is the quotation from that either story or a poem. A man named Dorud, Dorrud, walked outside and saw 12 people riding together to a women's hut. And then they all disappeared inside. Talking about creepy stories. He went up to the hut and looked inside through a window there, and he saw that there were women there and that they all had set up a loom. Men's heads were used for weights, men's intestines for the weft, I don't know what is weft, and warp, and a sword for the sword beater and an arrow for the pin beater. These women spin death, and when they're done, they tear the cloth into pieces, one for each of them. Holding their piece of cloth, they mount their horses and ride away, 6 to the south and 6 to the north. I'm like, dude, you as the author can be upset with the medieval church, demonizing everything and say, oh, this is the devil. And I can understand that because we as Christians many times miss all these entities and their identity, which is kind of normal because we weren't given or revealed everything in this lifetime. But how can you read stories and supposed eyewitness accounts? And we see this from many, both pagan accounts, but also church accounts. So we see here seculars or people who have beliefs in the old faith and the Christian faith. We see here so many stories that just point to like, hey, however you want to call these ladies of the night, and their leader, who will be sometimes seen as a god or a goddess, depending on which side of Europe, you cannot tell me that this is not a demonic entity. Maybe it's not a demon per se, but it is a demonic entity, because these women were able to slaughter men's warriors, 12 of them, like this, chop them into pieces, and then 6 of them left to the north, 6 to the south. It's not something that regular human women can do. So I don't see any problematic calling these entities as demonic or devilish. I mean, usually we say the devil as there is only one, but there are many devils if we will go into the meaning of the word. So there are many devils and many evil spirits, many foul spirits, and many demons. And there's nothing good about this. And here, a paragraph down, he says, we can therefore see that entities of all kinds with direct connection to the faith haunted the skies. So sometimes they'll be haunting, there are different stories. These armies of the dead would be haunting forest, and they'll be landing on the ground. Sometimes they'll be flying. From story to story, we see these differences. But for me, once when you see what they're doing and what effect they leave to people, are they making people closer to God? No. Are they making people read their Bible or pray more? No. Maybe out of fear for the spiritual protection of themselves and their homes. Yes. But these experiences are nothing beneficiary to one's soul or one's spirit. Does it take you closer to God? Does it make you have peace with God, enjoy his presence? None of those things. And now he switches to the subchapter called demonization. This is all in chapter 1. He says, all the traditions I have mentioned, which have condensed and then focused on fairies, were demonized. In the Malleus Maleficarum, which you and I will cover one day, and which was translated as the Hammer of the Witches, and which was printed around 1486 or 1487, the inquisitors Jacques Springer and Henrik Kramer regard riding with Diana or Herodias as roaming with the devil who had adopted this form and name, and that an imaginary ride like this occurred when the devil disturbed the spirit of the person enslaved to him by lack of faith in such a way that she believed what took place in dream was physically occurring. Renoir Sayat, born in Lucerne in 1545, so mid-16th century, offers a valuable testimony in his chronicle. And this is what he says. It is said that the good folk, and he capitalized G and F, good folk, and the furious army are made up of souls of people who died violent or premature deaths, who must wander the earth until the day that fate has fixed for their passing. These folk are friendly and kind, and enter the homes of those who speak well of them at night, cook, eat, and then leave again, but the amount of food does not diminish. These are some who have the folly to think that living men and women accompany them on their rounds and share their meals in order to gain greater good fortune. So people are doing this for superstitious reasons, also because they're scared, but also probably to get fortune, to get something from these entities. And this author, Renoir Sayat, actually, I don't know how to pronounce, reports that belief in the good ladies and their visit and meal, but he also combines it with that of night demons and the dead. In his interpretation of the Gospels in 1571, Johann Matthias throws into the same bag all creatures that wander the night. And he says, so who then are all these knocking and noisy spirits, unnatural deceits, Dame Herodias and Mother Hulda, the old purged with her furious army, the howlers, the sprites, the trolls, the dwarfs, if they're not demons? Again, the author has the same problem how Christians have interpreted stories in their own agenda, if I can put it that way. That is agenda as something bad, but in their own way of interpretation. Shaun, I've read a while. I've been reading for a while. So I want to just stop here for a second and ask you if you have any comment on what I've been reading in the last 5 minutes. It can be about either monks or when it comes to these entities. The thing that crossed my mind is when we cover some of the ghost stories in our eerie encounter segments, we encounter sometimes that people would move to a certain area or they were just traveling and would see a spirit or a ghost of a dead girl or a person who would be there. And these spirits or entities or ghosts, they would not be necessarily always evil. They'll be just there. They'll be just observing a family or an individual. They will not try to scare them. They will not look horrible. They'll be just there. And we would wonder in our assessment, like, hey, why is God allowing this? And this is why I'm having this parallel here in my mind, that these spirits, for whatever, but it says for the period of time they're left to roam here, many times they would die in horrible ways, like in the army or something like that, and for a certain period of time, and they call fate as Fate. But let's say, but because God is in the control of everything, let's say God is allowing them to be there. So for me, there's a parallel between those ghost stories of the girls that will be there, or people, adults, and here that people still see armies of some people who would not be malicious. They will come if they feel welcome. They also look like they're eating and sitting, but actually it's just an illusion. They wouldn't be eating or drinking, and they will disappear when the day would come. And you have to wonder and ask, well, if this is for a certain period, but it's happening for years and decades, when will it stop? And why is God allowing this? And my mind just went to those stories where we were reading about ghosts, like, why is this happening? So that's that's me thinking out loud. I don't know if you have any comment on that.
So two things. First, the those good folk that go in and cook and eat, and then they leave, and everything is just left where it is. I wonder if that's where we got the story from. I don't know. It was probably 100 years ago. I think they made a cartoon of it. The cobbler and the elves, where the dude, like, he was losing money and he was too old to work, and so he was making shoes, and so the elves come in while he's sleeping and make all the shoes for him. I wonder if that's probably the origin of that, the idea that these good spirits will come in and do things. And of course, in the cartoon, they're not spirits; they're just tiny creatures. But that's how they portray them for kids. Okay, and then what was the other question that you had? Because I wanted to say something about that, but I can't.
Well, no, I was wondering, like, if you have any parallel between the army of the dead still being there, like coming all over again, in the same place, doing the same thing, and God allowing this in the same fashion. Like, people will go to some places, they will feel like haunted, but actually this will not be benevolent spirits. They will feel like a ghost of a person who died there. It can be an elderly person or a girl who maybe just felt like they needed a company. Of course, I'm not saying I believe in this. We weren't there, but these are the stories. So I'm like, well, these stories have similarities. You have North America with these ghost stories. You have here medieval Europe. Like, these are the spirits of the dead soldiers or people who die in a violent death, and they're like still not able to move permanently to the another realm, right? To the God, to the God's realm, where He would judge them, or they will wait for the judgment. However, God decides, their fate to be. But so it's like, why is this happening? Like, what is bounding all these entities to a certain location, and they cannot seem to move on to another location or to another realm?
Yeah, I honestly don't think anyone knows. And I think that everyone just kind of throws ideas at it. Early Christianity, they had purgatory, like, oh, these were the saints in purgatory, and so they want you to pray for them. Or maybe these are malicious spirits that are awaiting their judgment in hell, and so now they're coming out to try to wreak as much havoc as possible. I have a friend who goes and visits Gettysburg at least once a year, and he says that there's tours that'll go out right before dawn, and they'll say in the mist on the field you can almost see the soldiers still out there. And like, I would not want to go to that, because to me that sounds creepy, and it sounds like it's super intrusive. And this, if they are spirits and they're still there, I mean, this would be an extremely private affair. This is where these guys died, and a lot of them were very young. I mean, I'm 35. Most of these kids were probably half my age. It's like that just doesn't feel right, but it's something that still happens, you know. Um, so I don't think anyone knows. And I think it's a phenomenon that we all encounter. So we could try to come up with explanations for, you know, the idea that, oh well, it's the dead coming to haunt you, maybe, or it's the spirits in purgatory, maybe. Um, but I don't think we know.
Cool. We're switching now to chapter 2, the phalanxes of demons. And this is what the author says. The belief that night attracted demons and the return of day drove them off was universally widespread. The Hebrews believed that the demons of the desert were particularly active from twilight to rooster's crow, which signified the return of light and possessed of apotropaic virtue. It broke spells and sent spirits fleeing. For Christians, this belief is illustrated by the story of Peter, who stops denying the truth, and the third crow of the rooster. And that's funny because we just talked about this story. Now he's switching to Greeks. The ancient Greeks recorded the movement of demons. Hippocrates, who lived about 460 to 370 BCE, speaks of terrifying images that emerge during the night through the agency of Hecate, the infernal goddess who rules the crossroads. That's very interesting because in the folklore of my people, crossroads at the nighttime are a no-no. You know, I'm not talking about cities and towns, but about villages and those rural places. Like, you don't go at the crossroads at the nighttime. The Greeks turned to charms and purification rites for protection from this goddess. An anonymous author of the 5th or 4th century BCE alludes to the nocturnal host of Hecate that shows itself at night, a point confirmed by a solia, Scholia, in the Agronautica but Apollonius of Rhodes in 3rd century, in which this apparition is given the name Hecatea. In his preparations for the gospel, Eusebius of Caesarea, who lived around 270 to 340 AD, informs us that the leader of the spirits that rule the night are the demons Serapis and Hecates, or known as Beelzebub. Now, when it comes to the legions of demons, this is how Severus, who lived in the 4th and 5th century AD, describes the invasion of a monastery. This is very interesting. Invasion of a monastery. You would think in monasteries should be the holiest places. They're like perfectly safe, but no. So this makes my mind explode. So Shaun, after this, I want to ask you a question. So this is how Severus described the invasion of a monastery by invisible demons in his Life of Saint Martin. And this is the quotation. Toward midnight, the entire monastery gave the impression of swaying to the muted noise of people walking about. In the young man's cell, numerous lights could be seen glittering, as well as a dull sound of many people going to and fro, and the murmur of many voices. That's end quote, but we have something additional coming to the story. Felix of Crowland described the demons that attacked Saint Guthlach in 7th. He lived this Saint Guthlac lived in the 7th and 8th century and carried him off in corpore to the very gates of hell. One night, Saint Guthlac, suddenly sees the whole tiny cell in his monastery, right, filled with horrible troops of foul spirits. Bursting forth from the earth and from the sky, they cover the space beneath the heavens with their dusky cloud. The lesson of the text is clear. Demons rarely traveled alone. Okay, I have more stories, but I want to stop here. Shaun, okay, this is my question of almost, well, I'm confused. I'm not anxious, but I'm confused. You would expect that people who devoted themselves and their lives to God, live in a monastery with other brothers, they're not perfect in any way or shape or form. They don't think they are. We don't think they are. Of course, that's out of the question. But they're dedicated their whole lives to God. You would think that the place they're dwelling is like a new Eden. It's holy, and it's protected by God's presence, maybe even by the angel guardians. Yet these demonic troops who come as hordes, they would attack the brethren, and these brethren would feel, I don't know if they would feel unprotected, but they would actually see how demons are coming from their dimension into their dimension and into their monastery. Um, I know you're just a mere man, so I cannot ask you why would God allow this. But spiritual warfare seems to me to be way more, much more complex than we imagine it to be. Is this also your understanding?
Yeah, there's a modern saint, Padre Pio, and of course, Shia LaBeouf just made a movie about the life of Padre Pio a couple of years ago. And one of the interesting points in his life, he ended up going home. He was, I think this was between him taking the vows for like the 3 year, and then he was going to go and take the vows for um, to have be like permanently consecrated to the Franciscan order. And so he went home for a time because he was a sickly person. And the his parents, their testimony was that every night his room was ransacked by demons. And so the first couple times that they heard sounded like people running around, furniture being moved, stuff like that. They went and they looked in the room, and he's standing in the middle of the room in prayer, and just the bed is flipped over, the chair is thrown, books are thrown off the shelf, the ink from the inkwell is all over the walls. Um, and of course he's just standing there stoic. And so eventually it got to the point that every night, and this would happen every night starting at 9 o'clock, every night at 9 o'clock he would latch the door from the inside to protect people from what was going on. And this continued throughout his life. And of course he also ended up having the stigmata, which is the wounds of Christ on his hands, feet. He had the wound on his side from the spear, and these were not just like superficial wounds. These had to be bandaged because they would bleed profusely. There's an exorcist, Father Carlos Martins, who actually has one of the one of the not bandages, but one of the night shirts that he would wear. And because he was so holy and people were coming to venerate him, like the church kind of knew. So they're like, instead of washing all your stuff, what we're going to do now is we're going to give you them, and you give them back to us every day. And we're just going to create this little hoard of relics because we know you're going to be like canonized as a saint. That's not even a question in our minds. And so he got one of these nightshirts, and he says you can see the wounds on the back from the flogging that Christ endured. So the question of like, why would God allow this? I think it's really twofold. One, um, maybe to perfect us in our humility and in our faith, and two, um, maybe God is allowing an extra portion of suffering to come onto the saints as a grace to protect the world from their sins. So it's almost like there is judgment due to the world, and he is heaping that extra portion onto the saints. Let's see. Many old Catholic places were purposely built over demonic places or sources of questionable lands. Spiritual warfare, I suppose, implies we may not always be impervious to the overflow of that work. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's lots of places where we know that churches are built over pagan sites. Even in, I think it's Mexico, you have these giant, beautiful cathedrals that are built over ancient Aztec worship sites. And it's an idea of like, we're claiming this space. This may have belonged to them, but it belongs to us now. And even though that's true, the serpent was in Eden. So even though it's true that is a place that is consecrated to God, it doesn't mean that the demons will not conduct siege against it, because they're not so worried about the rest of the world. They control the rest of the world. What they're worried about is tearing down the light that's set on a hill, because they don't want the world to see what God has and to repent.
Thank you, and thanks to PJ for that comment. In the Scala Coeli, which is another medieval work, Jean Gobi cites an interesting case. When bearing a vessel to a miser, I don't know what is a miser, miser, on his deathbed, an old man spots knights on black horses holding torches. These horsemen enter the house through the door, grab hold of the dying man's soul, and bear it off to hell. A little later, Jean Gobi relates an anecdote about demons living as a community. And this is what he says. An abbot and monk became lost on the way and met some monks in the forest who invited them to follow them to their abbey. Super creepy story. During the morning, the abbot gave a sermon on angels. When he talked of the first hierarchy, half of the monks left the premises. When he mentioned the second, the other half followed suit. When questioned, one of the monks explained, "We are members who have fallen from these orders," and the entire abbey vanished. It's like, what? Were they in the presence? Because, okay, Shaun, the only explanation that I find it plausible is that these used to be God's servants, but because they fell of this, and they once when they heard the sermon, they had to flee because the truth struck them like the air in their hearts. But one of them admitted, like, "Hey, we used to serve, we used to be like you, we used to serve God, but now we're not," and they fled. But if these monks were not preaching on this sermon, they'll be in the presence of demons who would embody to look like abbots, like monks, and they would not even know that. How crazy is that? So this, in the same fashion, we read this in the New Testament, like, hey, when you're giving, helping the poor, like, be aware because you may actually, face an angel who may come embodied, right? In the same fashion, you can actually be chatting, spending time with someone who looks like a human being, but it's actually a demon or someone who used to serve God and is whatever. Not everyone is a demon. And this again reminds me also of those stories with Bigfoot and maybe not necessarily Bigfoot, but anything that has ability to shape shift and change forms and like just appear out of thin air, be embodied for a short period and disappear. We see the same pattern through the ages, through cultures, through religions. It's just different entities, maybe they're even same entities, but in a different structures. Who knows? But like this struck me, the whole story struck me so hard. I'm like, dude, like they can be one of us, but they're actually not of us. They are not. It's only an illusion, like a magician is doing a trick. These monks, these brothers, they can be coming and dwelling with us. We may think they're brothers and sisters, but once when we start doing a spiritual thing, let's say take Eucharist, pray to Christ, they cannot do certain things because they know it's against them, because they rebelled and they don't serve God. Which also reminds me, throughout the years, I heard stories from ex-New Agers, people who've been spiritual warfare. They said, you don't know how many churches are infested or visited by witches and warlocks who are regular people, but they serve Satan, but they come there to inspect the territory. How strong is the church to bring the seed of division and all these things? And I'm like, dude, this is so freaking insane. The devil is not to play with. He's way more organized. He had eons and eons of preparing and orchestrating all of this. You cannot outsmart him if you think as a Christian, oh, well, I'm more powerful because I have, authority in Christ. Yes and no. You should not be poking the bear, and let alone the devil. So, wow, I don't know if you want to just say anything when it comes to these shapeshifters who like even able to deceive monks.
Well, what's interesting. So, me hearing, I was like, maybe these are a group of monks that had fallen away from the order, and they had committed themselves to perpetual service to God. And in their life, God was like, I mean, if you want to go away, I can't hold you to that. But in their afterlife, awaiting the judgment, he's like, oh yeah, I can make you fulfill that oath. So even though they wanted to fall away, until the judgment day, they're, I mean, I don't even want to say their penance, because I don't know if they're, going to be redeemed or not. But let's just assume that they're Christians. They just kind of fell away from their order. That their penance, in order to atone for their sins is that they will continue service in this abbey that doesn't even exist anymore in our realm until Judgment Day. That's pretty crazy.
I think I'll be almost freaking out, realizing, hey, I just spent the whole night with people that are not people. They just look like people, but they deceived us. They're actually demons. But one of them was kind enough, if that's a proper way, to tell the truth and say, yeah, we were one of you, but we turned. So once when we heard the sermon, we had to flee. Um, Honesty is rare among the hordes of dark, if we want to call them that way. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily demons, but they're not serving God, so whatever they are, uh, they're not in a good place. But yet, like I said, imagine spending night with someone and thinking they're humans made of flesh and blood, just like you, and they serve God, turn out to be no, you're deceived. Like, dang it, that'll be a story to tell. Okay, the
Well,
Dominican.
that actually. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I had heard a story very similar to that, in which there was a woman who ended up leaving her husband because he was an abusive husband, and moving in with someone that she had met through work, and it was this older lady, and her husband had passed away, and so she moved in with her, and she ended up living with her for a period of years until she got back up on her feet. Got on her feet, left the city, ended up going, getting married, having kids. Um, they were back in the city, and I can't remember the reason that they were coming back, but she wanted her husband to go and meet this lady that basically changed her life and saved her life. And she gets there, and there's nothing there. And so, she's like, okay, well, this was the address. I mean, I received mail at this address. This was my home. It turns out that the last thing that was there burned down in the 1950s. And so she had lived in this place for a period of years that didn't even exist. How do you explain that? Yeah. So I mean, compared to spending one night with them, I mean, like literally she received mail at this address that doesn't exist.
Wait, that just broke my brain. Wait. Okay. If we could try to rationalize it, I would say this was a God sent entity that was supposed to show kindness to this woman and help her. Once when she left, then the place took its old, look and shape and form. It looked miserable, and there was no more of this entity. It was, of course, not a ghost, but let's say it was an embodied angel. That sounds like actually like it's not unbiblical. It is biblical, and I would say it portrays perfectly the heart of the Father, who will do everything to show love and kindness to his children, not children, including people in general. So wow, that's amazing. The Dominican Etienne of Bourbon, who lived at the end of 12th and beginning of 13th century, mentions demons taking human form, in an exemplum. This is the story. A knight who had lived an evil life refused to go to Rome to make penitence, and his bishop commanded him to keep vigil all night in a church without speaking to anyone and without listening to anyone at all except for God and his saints. This knight was led into the church and the doors closed behind him. The knight kept vigil until midnight, praying peacefully in front of the crucifix. Through the devices of the devil, a gleam of light began illuminating the church as if day was dawning. He saw that through an open door, and some men and women started entering as if to pray. He then heard a noise as if numerous carts had pulled up, and he saw merchants enter the church who claimed his wife had sent them. They, excuse me, they demanded his assistance, but he refused. They retreated indignantly and pretending they had gone to his home, so they brought in a devil who had taken the form of his wife and another who has taken that of his son. Despite these events, the knight remained mute. The demons then took on the shape of the bishop and his clerics by saying the following: Benedict, my son, May God bless you. How did the night go? And other words of the same kind. But the knight remained impervious. He made the sign of the cross over his breast, and confounded demons transformed into hideous figures who hit and tortured him. So, like, whenever I think I've read a crazy story, we keep getting worse and worse stories. Like, imagine imagine how important would it be to these devils and demons the oath that the knight made just for one night. I'll spend seeking God's face. I'll be mute. I don't want to talk to anyone else, but I'll be here expecting God to speak to me. And then the devil and the demons, knowing this, it will bother them so much for whatever reason. It's just one guy, and coming and shape shifting, and in the shape of his son or a wife, and trying, and even the bishop, in trying to stir him up and confuse him, and just interrupt his communion with God. And he didn't want to let them win in this trickery game, in this game of spiritual warfare. When he made the sign of the cross, it says that the confounded demons transform into hideous figures who hit and tortured him. Unfortunately, it doesn't say in which way they hit and tortured him. I can't wrap my mind around this story. Like, it's really one of the most insane ones we ever read on the podcast, on any segment, be it theology, biblical story, extra biblical stories, apocrypha, Bigfoot stories, aliens, whatever. This is one of the craziest stories I've read. What is it about this story that speaks to your heart when it comes to this knight and his persistence? I want to have that spirit, that kind of attitude, to be honest.
Okay, so first I want to say, when you're talking, I shut off my video so that way I can hear, because the sound gets garbled because my connection is so bad. That's, I think, why I've been disconnected a few times. So I'm trying to shut down the data that's coming through so I can try to hear better. So I'm still here listening. Okay, so secondly, I'm reminded of the story. I think it's in either First Kings or Second Kings, of that man of God that came to the place, was performing miracles, but God told him the entire time you're there not to eat anything. And then there's that guy who said that he was a prophet of God because he didn't like what he was doing, and said, "Oh no, God said that you can eat, so I made you some food." He ate the food and died. And so it's like, you can see this. Okay, so God says to do this, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna obey, and then the wicked are coming to try to undermine that idea that you've had from, or that oath that you've made to God. So I mean, that's biblical. Secondly, the sign of the cross. I think it was Athanasius who said that at the sign of the cross, all of the all the devices of the demons are confounded. And so as soon as he made the sign of the cross, all the demons, like all of their magic of enchantment, showing that they were something that obviously they weren't, was dispelled, and they are exposed for what they really are, which is these horrific creatures. And they end up attacking, which, again, I mean, we have from the lives of the saints. Even Martin Luther was assaulted by demons, right? And so like, this is just really common tactic for demons to attack those who are coming and bringing truth. So this guy was wanting to do something good. His bishop told him to go in here and seek God's face and be mute the entire time. And so he was going here to connect with God, and of course the demons don't like that.
I have only one sentence from the book, and then I want to read one passage from the Bible and ask you what you think about this, because we've been talking for like almost an hour when it comes to these soldiers and phantasms and spirits, walking as troops and soldiers. Some of them walking, some of them flying, some of them riding on horses, as the spirit beings that can almost be embodied and hurt people if they choose to. The Bishop of Orange, Alphonse Despina, who died in the middle of 15th century, speaks of the troops of demons that appears on the roads like a vast army and is accompanied by a great noise. Now I have this passage from Zechariah chapter 1, verses 7 to 11. I'll read them. On the 24th day of the 11th month, the month of Shebat, in the second year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah, son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo. During the night I had a vision, and there before me was a man mounted on a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees in a ravine. Behind him were red, brown, and white horses. I asked, "What are these, my lord?" The angel who was talking to me answered, "I will show you what they are." Then the man standing among the myrtle trees explained, They're the ones the Lord has sent to go throughout the earth." And they reported to the angel of the Lord who was standing among the myrtle trees. And this is their report, very short one. "We have gone throughout the earth and found the whole world at rest and in peace." So, Shaun, are you telling me that even in the Bible we may have warriors and soldiers and horse riders who are appearing to be human, but they're not human? They're actually spirit beings who report to the Lord. I was thinking about this because when I covered the episode about a year ago on the angel of the Lord with Pastor Van Dorn, Zechariah 1 was one of so many passages we covered. And I was thinking about this. I was like, dude, this passage was so weird in Zechariah 1. And these soldiers, these spiritual soldiers, because they're not physical soldiers, they're reporting to the angel of the Lord that Pastor Van Dorn and some other scholars are understanding to be Christ in the Old Testament, right? This will be a Christophany, that Christ will show himself in this shape and form, right? So Christ, as the Lord of hosts, as the Lord of the armies, has armies of angels whom he sent throughout the earth to observe when it comes to peace, war, and stuff like that, and to report to him in the same way that kings had. So I'm thinking, dude, we read so many stories. They're coming from, most of them from Western Europe, throughout centuries, from mid to the end of medieval times, and most of them have so many similar elements. And one of them is that people would witness, and we'll read more of these stories. Yeah, some of those ladies of the night, they're flying, but let's stay to the ground troopers, right? They were, some of them were walking, some of them were riding on horses. They're like the fallen knights and the fallen soldiers. They will be like, for some reason, they'll be still kept to that region. They cannot flee. Their spirits or ghosts cannot go to the Lord so they can finally find rest. They'll be still left to roam in that area. And we may wonder why, but then when we go to Zechariah 1, God has certain soldiers, certain spiritual entities that he would send for the task of like, hey, go and patrol and let me know what you see. So I'm thinking, could it be, of course, we don't know, we're just assuming, we're just guessing, could it be that these ghostly soldiers, unless they're, they were like malevolent, could it be they're simply in some way protectors of the space, or simply observing what's happening, who belongs there, someone who's trying to torture animals or people, kill the innocent people who'll be on a farm, a family, and maybe intervene, or maybe even not, maybe report to whoever is their boss in the same fashion that these spiritual soldiers had to report to Jesus. I think we could draw some parallels, right?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that these are kind of along the same lines as far as drawing a parallel is concerned. I'm reminded of when Elisha was saying that there are more with us than who are against us, and then the servant was like, I don't see anybody, and so he prayed that God would open his eyes, and he's like, oh yeah, we have tons of people all around us, and those were the armies of heaven that were there to fight for them. Which is amazing, but it does point to a biblical truth that God does have armies set up for certain purposes. For that case, it was defending his prophet, but there could be armies that are set up in the spirit world for reasons as protecting certain territory. Could be, I mean, we don't know the mind of God, but I mean, he allows certain things to happen. And I wonder, we have these phenomena that occur where you have multiple people who see something, and maybe they'll see an event, but they'll all interpret it differently, or they'll all see it differently. And I wonder if it's not like there's not an objective guy on the horse, but it is there's something there, and the way that your mind interprets it is that it pulls on these different symbols and unites them together to form a cohesive idea of what's happening. And this is all happening subconsciously. So I wonder if in the same way that in the ancient time they would see maybe a guy dressed in armor on a horse with a sword, if today you wouldn't see a guy with maybe body armor and a gun. Like, it's not that the armies of heaven are changing, it's that the archetypes that we have loaded in our brain from our context are they're pulling at different symbols, and so we would have a different they would have a different expression for us. Just an interesting thought.
Yeah, that's a good one. The subchapter is called Demons or Remnants, question mark. The Russian Chronicle of Times Bygone reports a strange event that took place in the Ukrainian town of Polotsk in 1092. Though the different accounts are in agreement about the event, they diverge on the details, which allows us to see how the church distorts a piece of information. And now the author is going back with being upset with the church. The parts of this text in italics are the points that deserve particular attention. And now we'll read that text. In the year 6600, which was believed that was since then that was the creation of the world. So in the year 6600, something quite strange took place in Polotsk. It was produced in the imagination. At night, a loud noise would be suddenly heard in the streets. Devils galloped as if they were human beings. If someone tried to leave his house in order to see this better, the devils inflicted him immediately and invisibly with a fatal wound. People no longer dared leaving their homes. Next, these devils began to appear during the day on horses, and there were no means to see them. People could see the shoes of their horses, though. They also ate the folk of Polotsk and its surrounding area, so people began to say, the inhabitants of Polotsk, by all evidence, are being murdered. This phenomenon first occurred in Drutsk. That's, I guess, another town in Ukraine, at least in that time. During this period, there was a sign in the heavens, like a very large wheel in the middle of the sky. That summer, the weather was so dry that the earth was consumed thereby, and many forests burst into flames by themselves, as did the peat bogs. There were many signs here and there, and a large invasion of Polovtsians, people of this region. That same summer, Rurik, the son of Rotislav, died. At the same time, many people died from a host of illnesses. So many died that some coffin sellers were prompted to say, from St. Philip's Day to the beginning of Lent, we have sold 7,000 coffins. Now this all occurred because of our sins had multiplied like our iniquities. God inflicted this upon us so that we would perform penitence and turn away from sin, envy, and all other malignant undertaking of the evil one. End quote. Different texts stress from the first that the troop of devils is the fruit of the imagination. They use the word that corresponds to phantasma and enigma, and the doubt therefore persists. They diverge from each other on the demon's stampede, and the Hypatian copy, some guy, maybe historian, notes the following. It moaned like human beings. Last, the Radziwill text uses the word knave or necroi to designate what slays the Polotsk people and to suggest that inhabitants of Polotsk were devoured by the dead. The compilers therefore waver between demons and the dead. So they don't know what were these phantasms, if they were like zombies or demons. But we can take a stand at the dead based on a philological element and the context. The word nave, N-A-V-E, is relatively rare, and it is apparently regarded as a non-literary term. It was therefore removed by the copyists of the Lamartine text, and there we find in its place an adverbial expression that means not in dream, but really open or openly, and so on and so on. I'll stop here because there's a lot of text. Okay, Shaun, my question is like, again, the author of the book, Claude Lecoteau, is upset how Christians have turned the story to say maybe God is upset with us so we can basically repent from our sins. Yes, not every sign in the sky is from God. Not every sign is for our damnation. Like if you will see comet or you will see, I don't know, anything astronomically happening, not everything is because Jesus is coming or we have to repent. It could be, it doesn't have to be. So I can understand that he was frustrated. But I'm just asking you, and of course we're all biased, right? As Christians, you know, if you can try imagining yourself living in this spirit and you see something like this, spiritual armies or signs of spiritual events in the sky, would you be one of those people that will say, hey, this must be from God? God wants us to repent before he comes and judges us. I understand that this makes sense, but nowadays, living 1,000 years after people in Ukraine of the 11th century, I think that doesn't always have to be. So again, I partially understand the author, but I also understand the people of that time who were like religious, but also superstitious. They're like, they don't know what's happening. They're like, oh, this is from God, like maybe he wants us to repent, or like he'll basically like judges us. I don't want to say kill us. So imagine if you were a citizen or someone who was dwelling, living in Ukraine in the 11th century. Would you be one of those who would be having that type of understanding of what was happening in the skies?
Yeah, I think that's the only the only understanding you can come to, right? Like what exists in the sky at that time? There's no airplanes, no helicopters, no drones, no spaceships, no satellites. So, I mean, what inhabits the sky? That's that the sky is what is proper to heaven and the heavenly realms. So, if you see a sign in the sky that you don't understand, obviously it's from God. And so forgive me, but I'm kind of getting a little miffed at the author, because could you imagine somebody writes a book about events that happened in the 1400s in North America, and they just say, yeah, those dumb Indians, they just didn't understand anything, and these things came about by this and this. You would never say that, but somehow it's okay to say it about Christians. You would never say it about a Buddhist. You would never say it about Islam. But somehow saying, "Oh, they just didn't understand," or "Yeah, they just changed the story." Well, of course they didn't change the story. The story happened there. It's in their context. They get to interpret it, right? Like, yeah, it's just the idea that, oh, it's okay for us to all bash on Christians, but we won't do it to anyone else. No, I don't think you should do it to anyone else, and you definitely shouldn't do it to Christians, because those are they are as indigenous a group of people as Muslims are in the Middle East. So let's just have act even-handedly. Don't. It's not okay to bash on Christians, especially Christians who have been Christian for as long as they can remember. That's their worldview. That's how they interpret things, and that doesn't mean that they're superimposing anything on it. They are Christian from their roots. They are Christian to their bones. It's not something that's foisted upon them. They just simply are, and they need that needs to be understood when they're interpreting these things. Try to get away from this idea. It's so common in the Western world that there's an objective truth, and then there's all this subjectivity that is then added upon it by preconceptions of the Western people. But yet we don't do that with anybody else. Can we please stop doing that with the Christians? They had a worldview. They had a legitimate understanding. They had a point of view. Let's just accept that. Sorry, rant over.
No, it's fine. I just want to say that I honestly I'm trying to place myself in the shoes of those 11th century inhabitants of Ukraine. Um, yeah, I probably would think the same like them. I'll be like, especially because they saw these soldiers riding on horses, but you don't see the whole horse. You just see horseshoes moving. You see like people who are selling coffins. 7,000 people died. So whatever they saw in the sky, they later saw people dying through mysterious illnesses and deaths. So they thought this was like a premonition, like a divine sign from God that unless they repent, they will die in the same fashion. Which reminds me of Jesus' story when that tower collapsed. He says, "Do you see these people? They're not more sinful than any other people, but unless you repent, you'll die, you'll perish like them." I'm paraphrasing slightly, but that's the story. So I'm thinking, well, it makes sense that the people of this time would see that way. But like, if I would see that now through the 21st century eyes, knowing what I know, not that I know a lot, but I have this privilege of checking history books that they couldn't check, and I can compare some stories in different eyewitness accounts throughout the whole world and come up maybe, just maybe, with slightly better, explanation. Maybe I wouldn't lump everything into like God's judgment or something that is coming from God. Maybe I would say like, hey, this is demonic or maybe demonic. So if I don't get closer to God, so He will protect me. Maybe I will die. Doesn't matter by whose hand I die, but I want to die. If I die, I want to die, being reconciled by God. Or maybe I don't want to die. I want my family and I to be saved. And what is the better way to be saved than by being in God's will? So, it's a very difficult um, it's a difficult task that the author of the book is trying. He's like, hey, these Christians changed the pagan roots and made everything about God, the church, sin, devil, demons. I understand, but on the other hand, it's not that far fetched. It's like there's also a lot of truth in there. Like, just because they're coming from pagan sources and have pagan names, who are these gods and goddesses? Who do you think they are? It's like, check the Bible. They exist, but they're called with different names. And this chapter is ending with demonic animals, which we don't have to cover, but basically the wild hunt. All these soldiers will usually be followed by the wild beasts, dogs, or so-called hounds. And this is something that is very normal. Buy the book and read for yourself. Chapter 3 is called The Troops of the Dead. Like demons, the dead who have not found rest or who are suffering the punishment of purgatory often moved about in a troop. The Greeks believed that the revenants returned to Hades with the dawn, and Propertius, I don't know who that was, in the work called Elegis, put these words in their mouths, quote unquote. By night we range in wandering flight. Night frees the prisoned shades, and Cerberus himself strays at will, the three-headed dog. Night frees the prisoned shades, and Cerberus himself strays at will. The bar that chains him cast aside. At dawn, hell's ordinance bids us return to the pools of Lethe, Lethe. An Orphic hymn that perhaps dates back to the 3rd or 4th century before, no, actually AD, alludes to Hecate, which we mentioned, daughter of the Titan Perseus, a goddess, who wanders the night with a retinue of the dead and dogs, as described in the register of Inquisitor Jacques Fournier, Bishop of Pamiers, who led the persecution of the Cathars in the upper Ariege region around 1320. The beings who roam the night are neither fairies nor demons. They're dead people who do not frequent sordid areas and do not enter poorly kept houses. Weipert, who is an archdeacon of Toul, writes in his Life of Pope Saint Leo around the year 1060 the following. Some years before the death of Saint Leo, a vast company of individuals garbed in white was seen advancing towards the city of Narmi. They marched in ranks from morning to almost there in the afternoon before settling down at the fall of night. The citizens of Narmi grew alarmed, believing they were under attacks by enemies. One man, most courageous than others, Notice in the crowd an individual he knew and went out of the city and asked him the identity of this troop. The other responded, "We are souls who have not yet atoned for our sins, and because we are not pure enough to enter heaven, we are visiting holy sites as penitence." Our brave men were so terrified by this vision that he remained ill for an entire year. In 1135, Hugues de Mons relates the story of a knocking spirit or poltergeist. It concerns a deceased individual who has a request that he desires to give to his family. And this is the quote: "Alas," said the voice, "since coming from remote lands and through many perils, I have suffered from storms, snow, and cold. So many fires have burned me, and so many bad weather I have tolerated in coming here. Nicholas, my brother, my sister-in-law, my nephews, and other friends, have no fear, for the power to cause anyone harm is not granted me. You should, however, protect yourselves by making the sign of the cross over your brow and over your heart. It is a fact that a wicked throng that is eager to work evil has come in with me and will retreat with me when I leave, so that I may leave the pernicious road they travel and fully enjoy eternal rest. Please celebrate a mass for me tomorrow." I'll stop here for a second. Shaun, this is a theologically loaded section that is titled, this subsection is titled "An Itinerant Purgatory." So here we see that a human being saw someone he knew in the field. He approached him and he said, "Hey, I'm left here roaming because I didn't atone for my sins. I guess he didn't repent. He died and he's quote unquote doomed for a season to visit holy places so that hopefully he can atone for his sins and I guess go to God." He says, "I will not hurt you, but there are those who are coming with me who may hurt you. So do the sign of the cross, protect you and yourselves." Wow, if this story is true, granted, we here have a story of it says poltergeist, but let's call it a ghost, who, because they know the living person and they recognize him as a cousin, as a friend, as a neighbor, doesn't matter, wishes him well, especially because this ghost wants to atone for his sins. So it's like his heart is in the right place. So he's warning him to protect himself by the sign of the cross and protecting his family. This is one of rare cases whenever we cover supernatural supernatural stories and supernatural accounts, that we see, like we mentioned, those girls who will be sometimes not evil, not good. They'll be like just minding their own business. But in this case, the spirit, the ghost, is actually trying to help a living human being by giving him the strategy: do the sign of the cross and be careful, because someone who is coming after me is way more powerful and wants to hurt you. So this is actually a good account that someone in the spirit realm wants to help a living person. What is your comment on that?
So this just brings to mind two instances that I can think of in somewhat modern lore. The first one is I think it's the Christmas Carol, right, where you have Ebenezer Scrooge, who's visited by his friend who passed on before him, and was like, "Hey, you're going to receive some other visitors, and don't mess with them because they're much more powerful than me. But I'm just here to explain to you that the way that you're living is not right, and you need to amend your ways." The second that I'm thinking of is I don't know if you watched the Pirates of the Caribbean, but with Davy Jones, when Bootstrap Bill is part of his crew, and then he's like, he still has those ties to Will, and so he's like, "Hey, yeah, the crew is like no good. You gotta protect yourself, this, that, and the other." But then they end up going and trying to redeem him. So yeah, like that to me, it just, when I read that's what I was reminded of, is that Pirates of the Caribbean, where you have this group of like the damned that are constantly moving around, but yet they can still have their attachments to certain people, and so might still want to protect people that they know and love, but yet they're still tied to the ship.
And there are more stories, but we'll skip them when it comes to this itinerant purgatory. So the subsection is, the next one is called the Spirit's Mass. And I want to read a little bit from this section. There's another common theme that strongly emphasizes how the dead assemble in the group. The Mass celebrated by spirits, a long-standing theme which appears in the historical work of Gregory of Tours, who lived in the 6th century, and which we can find throughout medieval Europe. Here are several of the most significant examples. This is the first one. Bishop Tietmar of Mersburg, whatever that is, records a true story in his Chronicum, chapter 1, verses 11-12, which says the following. The priest of Wolsblun Castle is on his way to sing matins at the church. But on entering the cemetery, he spies a crowd of people that makes offerings to a priest, and the members of the crowd stand at the door of the building. He stops, makes the sign of the cross, and he enters the chapel. A woman he knows and who has died recently asks him, what is he doing there? And he tells her. She then lets him know that he has not much longer to live. A similar experience occurs to a priest of Deventer. He reports the event to the Bishop Baldrich, who then commands him to spend the entire night at the church. The dead then throw him out of the building along with his bed. Another night he brings holy relics with him and sprinkles holy water about the church, but the dead emerge at their customary time, grab him, and burn him. Aldrich explains that the day belongs to the living and the night belongs to the dead. In his book Miracles and Apparitions, written between 1063 and 1072, Peter Damian cites the case of a woman who mistakenly attended a mass of the spirits in the Basilica of Santa Maria of Campitella on the night of Assumption, and a recently departed gossip tells her that she has no more than a year left to live. Encountering the dead is fraught with danger. In the life of John Ogmundarson, who was a bishop of Holar in Iceland and who died in 1121, monks interred in a church attack an old woman who comes in to pray. In 1516, a woman attended a spirit's mass by chance and recognizes one of her neighbors, who warns her that she should leave the church before the consecration and flee without looking back. To stay means the dead will tear her to pieces. The old woman follows this advice, but the dead, in their pursuit of her, rip away her coat. The next day, she sees that a piece of her coat is on each of the graves. Oh my gosh. Shaun, this was one of the freakiest things I was reading when I was checking the first segment of the first part of the book, the 7 chapters. It's not the story, this last story, but then the spirits have their own wicked mass. Dude, this reminds me of that metal band Black Sabbath. It's like, I don't even know their songs and lyrics, but just the name reminds me, Black Sabbath, and this is the spirits mass. What kind of wicked satanic thing is happening here? The spirits of the dead, who are most of them are evil, right? Because they want to hurt the living. They're actually meeting in literally physical church buildings to perform their wicked, mass, which is probably the upside down imitation of the Christian mass. And if a believer, a Christian person, enter the church and they're there, they will attack this person and try to even kill them. I have so many questions when it comes to this story. Like, again, why would God allow this? Why is this even happening? How often is this happening? For what person? All these questions. But what is your understanding? Like, why would spirits get together for this purpose to celebrate a mass? How it can help them? Because this is not the mass where they would believe they're taking Christ in themselves. Could it be a reversion of that, like a satanic mocking of actually Christ's sacrifice, his body and his blood?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, according to Roman Catholic doctrine, which of course we're talking about, these places that are Catholic, the mass has to be performed for the dead because the dead cannot partake of it, right? So the idea that they would have their own mass that would happen at night, like, to me, that's just weird and dark and freaky. And then the fact that, like, they burned a guy, um and then they tried to attack a woman and ended up ripping her cloak, and then they have it on these graves. Dude, I there's something demonic that's going on there. Like, I do not think that people who worship God, even if somehow they would be bound to the earth, would be participating in that level of desecration, uh, to make desolate the things that are gods, and also would not be participating in that kind of violence, right? I mean, when you think of the saints, that's not what you think of. So uh, I I mean, does it come down to just poor biblical literacy, where they're just like, we're going to assign things to this phenomena, and we're going to say that they're the dead in Christ, and in reality they're not? It's purely demonic. But maybe they're just not biblically literate enough to know that the dead in Christ will be with him in heaven. And I'm not necessarily arguing for that's where they are, because I know that there's people who take different stances, but at least they would be sanctified enough that they're not going to be behaving like this, right? Um, but then the idea that they would desecrate something as holy to them, at least when they were living. I mean, we don't all have to agree that the mass is some holy thing, but at least to them it was, that they would be participating in some sort of sacrilege regarding it. That's just, I mean, I could see why it would be so disturbing that it would be recorded, and so we have it to available to us today. But man, I just don't see any grounds for saying that people who were Christians when they died, even if they were able to, as being present here, would participate in something like that.
Yeah, in his histories written between 1028 and 1049, the cleric named Ralph Glaber puts these words in the mouth of an undead member of a large throng, which the revenant addresses to Brother Wulferius. We're all professing Christians, but as we defended our homeland against the Saracens, we were separated by the sword from our mortal flesh. A divine dispensation has been made to take us into the company of the blessed, and as it happens, we were due to pass through this region because many from this region are shortly to join our company. This belief is a gathering in a gathering of the dead into a throng before the final voyage closely agrees with and feeds a Christian myth that claims that between the moment of death and the time of Christian burial, the soul must undertake a journey to its final place of judgment, where its fate will be fixated while it awaits final judgment. Often this stopping place occurs at or involves crossing over the bridge of St. James, Santiago de Compostela, which is in Spanish, and it connects to the Milky Way as the road of souls. Those who pilgrimage there find that their souls are exempt from having to travel this pathway after their deaths. Okay, Shaun, you were growing up as a Catholic, right? Okay. Have you ever heard of this belief, again, that from the moment of our death and the time of our burial as Christians, the soul must undertake a journey to its place of judgment, where its place will be fixed while it awaits final judgment. Often the stopping place occurs or it involves crossing the bridge of St. James, whatever that is, and connects to the Milky Way. I don't know if they're talking about galaxy as the road of the souls. Are you familiar with any of these maybe teaching as a former Catholic, or any of these writings of the place where the soul travels between the death and the final judgment?
None of that is Roman Catholic doctrine. So that might have been something that was like a local belief there. I have heard about the Milky Way, right? But that's not, again, that's more of like just an ancient understanding. That's not really, I mean, not at all a Catholic belief. I think everything that I've heard in reading, even Cardinal Ratzinger's works, where he talks about purgatory and his kind of idiosyncratic beliefs on how that could work. It all seems to be fairly immediate. There's not really any like you don't have to join a troop to cross over. Now there are some beliefs of like your guardian angel takes you into the presence of God, or that the Virgin Mary comes to take you into the presence of God, or that your patron saint will come and take you into the presence of God. So there are those kind of things, but it's less of a we're going on a voyage and more of a they're coming down, grabbing you by hand, and then taking you up to where you'll be. Um, and yeah, to me, the idea of we're gonna join the wild hunt and kind of journey across the bridge of Terabithia, that's yeah, I don't think so.
I was wondering why Milky Way. Is it because some of those ancient people, Christian or not, but in this case they were religious, they would think like, oh, you're going to God, and God is always seen to be up or above, and you're going to join Him. So they would look to the stars, and if they would think that the soul goes to the farthest their eye could reach, like Milky Way. I mean, I don't know. I'm just trying to understand what was the logic behind this belief, where the soul will go before the, before the final judgment. You go like basically almost like being this silver surfer, surfing, among the stars. I mean, it sounds cool, but that's why I wanted to check. Like, I don't know if Catholics would believe this, so I just wanted to double check.
So with the Milky Way, like that was, I mean, even outside of Christianity, that was the belief that is the path that the soul takes to journey. And I haven't seen the Milky. I mean, we live in light pollution, so like you look up and you can see a dozen stars. I mean, if you're lucky. But back then they had a clear view of the sky and they could see so much more. And so for me, it's not really intuitive because I don't have the opportunity to look at it and say, oh, well, yeah, it looks like this winding path, or I don't know, maybe. But yeah, I mean, it was basically all the ancient cultures that I knew understood that the Milky Way was the path to the next life.
Okay, we'll be dealing with chapter number 4, the Phantom Armies, and then we'll summarize chapter 5, 6, and 7 because they're very related. They have to deal with 3 different ways of how the Wild Hunt armies are seen, so we can go through the last 3 chapters faster. But let's focus currently on chapter number 4, named the Phantom Armies. The Phantom Armies, which are present with 2 facets. On one hand, there are the dead who continue to wage their battles after their deaths, and on the other hand, the armies that loom up in the skies on the eve of a conflict or on certain dates that commemorate a bloody confrontation. In Damascus in 5th and 6th century, there is a story that tells us how Attila wages a terrible battle beneath the walls of Rome, after which the souls of the dead still fight there with singular ferocity for 3 days and 3 nights. Around 150, some dude whose name starts with letter P mentions the great soldier of Marathon. At Marathon, every night you can hear horses neighing and men fighting. No one who has expressly set himself to behold this vision has ever received any good from it. Another guy, Paulus Diaconus, who lived in 720 to 787, was the historian of the Lombards. He notes that during the year of 590, marked by a great pestilence, the noise of battle trumpets and a noise like the sound of an army can be heard both night and day. In May 1236, Matthew Paris, Chronicle for St. Albans Abbey, states that it is possible to see a battle that takes place in the sky over the land of Wales. Felix, who lived in 15th century, then Christophe Besold, who lived a century later, and Jacob Thamasis tell us the following. After defeating Ottokar, Rudolf of Harzburg spent the night on the battlefield. Toward midnight, spirits could easily be seen, and strange sounds and rattling noises were made by the dead who had fallen in battle. There were diabolical glamours, but the folk of this time were convinced that they were souls of the slain continuing to fight. Shaun, you mentioned this your friend going to that field once a year, and he would see still something like almost strange in the distance. This story reminds me of your friend's story. It's so weird, and it's like different continents and separated for almost a millennia, like right, like 1,000 years. It's a similar experience. Like, imagine that happens to you. Would you dare to go there and maybe try to see something from? I'll be honestly, I'm of curious mind. I'll be intrigued to go and actually see something from from close space to actually, not necessarily take a photo. If I don't even know you can take a photo of spirits, but I'll actually see, not disturb them, not speak to anyone, but maybe just get closer to see, like, hey, is this my imagination? Is maybe the weather? Did they drink or eat something bad? Do I have food poisoning? Like, or is this like I want to go and see closer? But I don't know. Again, if we as Christians are called to go and poke the bear, and if you happen to be in a place that is either haunted or visited by someone, and you don't know, that's one thing. But I don't know if we have this knowledge in advance, if we should even go there and like bother the dead. I mean, I don't even know if their spirits can be bothered by the living people. And why would they be even bothered if someone comes who is unrelated to them, didn't even harm them, comes centuries and generations later, and for me, even from another continent? I wouldn't even know if that would stir up the atmosphere, so to speak, or if God would bring the peace and stillness if someone who is a person of faith would walk in such a midst. But do you think that would be foolish? Or it will be okay if you're just curious and you happen to be there, and like your friend sees something in the distance. Oh, could this be like a spirit or a ghost of a soldier? Let me get closer so I can actually inspect. Do you think this would be forbidden or not?
I don't know if it'd be forbidden. I don't know if it'd be wise. I mean, you always have that, possibility of the hitchhiker phenomenon. So you're going there to see something spiritual. You're participating in something spiritual, and you could take something spiritual back. Another thing that I was thinking of while you were talking about the events happening on different continents, and that is true, they're happening on different continents. But one thing that we often forget, especially here in North America, is they're the same people, right? This is you're talking about something that happened in Italy, right? Italians came to North America. I mean, you have the same. We are Europeans. So as much as we're separated by an ocean, we're one people. So we share a common culture, we share a common history and heritage. So that's something that has to be considered when it's like, well, these things are happening in Europe and they're happening in America. Well, yeah, it's one. We're one people, just separated by an ocean. But no, as to going and seeing things that have happened, I've heard that a lot, that on the day commemorating the event, that there's always something weird that happens. And not necessarily just with Gettysburg. I mean, I'm sure that it does. It was such a terrible, terrible massacre. But I mean, it's almost just intuitive, right? If if there was a murder that took place at say a house, and you knew the day and the time that it happened, how could you, like, you just intuitively know on that day at that time, don't be there, right? Because it's just it can't be good, right? So yeah, I don't know if it's forbidden. I think it could be foolish. I mean, I'm curious. I would love to see it, but I'm also hesitant because I know about the hitchhiker phenomena, and I don't want to be trying to get rid of something because I was curious.
Okay, then we have this subsection called Wonders and Omens, which, of course, we don't have time to deal with all of this, but I want to read one small section. On April 29, 1506, in Nordfeld, near the Jungsberg, people saw an army of headless knights, all dressed in red. Coming to meet it was another army, all in white, that attacked it and put it to flight, whereupon the white army pursued the red into the heart forest. These fighters were so huge that they strode over the trees. The apparition could be seen at noon for 4 weeks without interruption, to the great terror of the entire region. In 1520, so 14 years later, in Wissembourg on the Rhine, a strange noise was heard in the sky around noon. It was a terrible din of crashing arms and shouts like those made by soldiers mounting an assault. The inhabitants thought that they were under attack by an enemy, and they were hastily retrieved, hastily retrieved their weapons. So again and again, we see similar stories with some different elements, but repeating over and over again, not just in the nighttime, but also in the daytime. Different parts of Europe, similar things that will be happening not just once, that will be continuing happening day after day, week after week, to the multitudes of people. Sometimes it will be like bad omens, like telling you something will happen and people will be dying, or sometimes people will be revisiting probably a battle that happened, on the ground, but they'll be like seeing either in the sky or on the ground, like they'll see the same image of the battle happening over and over again, which is so weird. It's like you're stuck in a time or in this time loop until who else but God would come and stop to that, so that people in their souls will have peace, but also the inhabitants of that land would be freaking out and thinking to move out. Imagine that happening for 4 weeks, for a month. You see the battle noise of these soldiers who are they're visible, but they don't exist. And it's so loud, it freaks you out. You actually think that you're invaded by the enemies. That will mess you up to your life. I mean, until your last breath. It's like, and there are also photos like this, not photos, but images of heavenly armies, which will be basically people dying in battles and all fighting the same fight in the sky. A critical piece of evidence. We should note that extremely critical testimony provided by the Bishop of Paris, William of whatever. In his criticism, he wonders if these armies are of spiritual substance and if they are good or malign. He responds that they're not flesh or real. They have no bodies. They're invulnerable, and they're the mystifications of demons. And it is wrong to say that they appear only at crossroads. William then concluded with an interesting debate that continues on into the 16th century, when another knight appeared in the shape of man and spoke to people. It's almost a whole page. We don't have time for that, so I'll just skip that whole quotation. So William bases his acceptance of the dead returning on a very ancient belief, which maintains that a man receives a certain duration of life at birth, 70 years, according to some, and is not able to reach the beyond until the assigned terms have finally elapsed. Very interesting. So let's say you're given 70 years at birth by who other than God, and you die when you're 14, right? So for the next 56 years, you're doomed supposedly to roam the earth. That's basically the explanation. That's the mathematics. Those who die prematurely are those therefore condemned to roam the earth until that date. Yet William does not think these souls have bodies. He believes they're images, semblances of bodies who have come from purgatory, which is revealed by his final allusions to suffrages. I don't know what is a suffrage, but yeah, that was the end of that whole segment. Now he's switching to the concluding parts. He mentions purgatory. He mentions again Diana, Herodias, Perst, all these gods and goddesses from the first and second chapter, and basically that's that. And now we'll be concluding the episode with a section 2, the supernatural hunters, where basically he says that in all the stories that he compiled and he assessed, there are 3 different types of these diabolical armies. So he says the term hunt and hunter used in folk traditions are remnants of an ambiguous and often inappropriate use, and they have therefore caused numerous errors of interpretation. I propose these three definitions. First one, the diabolical huntsman. The subject of this chapter is a demon that sets off in pursuit of a person. He appears mounted on horseback and is most often accompanied by a pack of hounds. So again, the first one is the diabolical huntsman, who is a demon followed by a pack of wild dogs, and he's in a pursuit of a person. It doesn't say if it's a human person or not. The second theory is the wild huntsman, whom we will examine later in chapter 6, and who is a being of folk mythology, a daimon, not demon, but Greek daimon, who primarily victimizes supernatural creatures. So he doesn't attack people, he attacks spiritual beings. He owns no dogs except in traditions that appear after the Middle Ages. Indeed, he is a tracker. And the number 3 is the cursed huntsman, whom he will look later in chapter 7, and who is a man on horseback and who, with his pack of dogs, pursues a prey that eternally eludes him. So in the first case, the diabolical huntsman, the prey of the supernatural hunter is a human being. In the second case, the wild huntsman, mainly found in folk traditions, this human being is usually a minor figure of the supernatural world. And in the third case, the cursed huntsman, the hunter's prey is an animal. The hunter is at times a demon and sometimes a devil. The prey is most often a revenant, a sinner, or a damned soul, because, again, stories change from region to region. During the 13th century, we find mention of a diabolical huntsman, who was the first of these three definitions, in the exemplum called The Priest's Concubine, written by the Cistercian monk Caesarius of Heisterbach. And this is a quotation on the whole page. Let me just find something when it comes to the conclusion of this diabolical huntsman story. According to Heliand and Passavanti, the horse that is being used by the diabolical huntsman is actually a demon entrusted with the duty of torturing the human beings. The Tuscan preacher develops the story more fully, and the story is on a page and a half. This is another story. So the Tuscan preacher develops the story more fully, adding the names of the protagonists and more gory details, transforming Helinand Exemplum into a veritable novella. I wish I can read the story, but it's super long. We don't have time for that. And basically, that's the end of the chapter that is titled The Diabolical Huntsman. So this is not a good guy. The second theory is that there's, in stories like this is a slightly different story, and this is a wild huntsman. Around 1250, in the region east of the Rhine, the first stories appeared that describe a diabolical and often gigantic figure who hunts fairies or dwarfs. In the Song of Ecke, Dietrich von Bern, in other words, Theodoric the Great, meets in the Tyrol forest a wild maiden named Babehild. She rules a kingdom in the sea and is pursued through the forest by its lord and his pack of hounds. He's named Fasolt, and he rules over the wild lands. This figure is a giant who blows a horn, is clad in armor, and wears his hair braided like a woman. When he catches sight of Dietrich, who protects Babehild, he enters into a rage and says, "You have taken my maiden from me. I have pursued her today from yon far mountain. What gives you the right to steal my prey?" Because Dietrich is wounded, however, Fasolt does not engage him in combat. Fasolt and Babehild are both supernatural creatures, but the anonymous authors offer no reason for this hunt. We should note, however, that a certain Fasolt appears as a weather demon in a charm from the end of the 15th century, because, again, stories change. All is made somewhat clear when we refer to the virginal and to its variations, Dietrich and his companions, in the first adventure of Dietrich, which is a romance and adventure story from the end of the 13th century, centered on the adventures of Dietrich von Bern and Virginal, queen of the populace of dwarfs who live in the caves of the Tyrol. Each year, Virginal must deliver a young girl to a tribute to a giant named Orchis, whose name bring to mind a picture of an ogre. Once selected, the victim enters the forest, where she will be pursued by Orchis and devoured. Here, the story matches the legends connected to place that spirits who tolerate only those who regularly offer them sacrifices in their territories, and so on and so on. We'll have to skip this. I'll tell people buy the book because the book is currently on sale. We also have testimonies and more stories coming from other people, including clerks. So there's this. Okay, maybe I can read quickly this. There's the testimony of Renward, who is a town clerk of Lucerne, and who is tackling the theme of the diabolical huntsman on several occasions. And two passages from his work are quite significant. And this is the quotation. Another ghost lingers in the mountain near Lake Pilatus. He gives shepherds no end of trouble and bothers the animals, especially in areas where people live dissolute lives with no fear of God. This is the infernal or diabolical huntsman who is called Turst, Turst. At the fall of night, he goes out with a pack of hounds and descends on poor livestock, which then scatter and stop giving milk. He blows his hunting horn, and the poor beasts are compelled to come to him. Then there are his diabolical dogs who run on three paws, barking with a hollow and unnatural sounds, as if they were muffled. When they hear them, the animals scatter. Often heard in the mountains and in the thick forest in the night, huntsmen and evil spirit. Often heard in the mountains and in the thick forest is the night huntsman, who is an evil spirit. He hunts at night with his dogs, blowing his horn, and with other companions, as men are accustomed to do while hunting. His dogs have been seen running on their three paws, I don't know why three, and baying in muffled, hoarse, and terrifying voice. They are a great peril. They are a great peril for livestock, which becomes terrified when they hear them and then scatter and sicken. There are way more other stories in different countries like Denmark. We'll have to skip all of this. There's also mentioning of the rooster and dogs, all these folklore stories. But I'll just read the ending paragraph of this chapter 6. The legend of the diabolical hunter, which fits into the large cycle of the punishment of sin, is therefore highly Christianized, but rare testimonies inform us that the figure is not of Christian origin, but the cursed hunter is a creation of the church. Okay, I see. And I think in this context, he may be right that the church has significantly altered the story, maybe to even scare the churchgoers, who knows? Because, hey, we're Christians, but we're called to speak the truth. We know many bad examples of pastors and priests and popes in the history. Maybe these stories were twisted to scare people into repentance and coming to God by, altering stories and making them as a tool of fear. And the last theory is the cursed hunter, right? So the first one was the diabolical huntsman. Then we had this wild huntsman, and now the cursed hunter. And the cursed hunter. Can you please mute yourself? Okay, so the last one is the cursed hunter. The legend of the cursed hunter remains beyond all transformation, an exemplum intended to illustrate the post-mortem fate of a sinner. It presents no major difficulties because, contrary to texts we have uncovered, its structure is closed and the possibilities for interpolation remain weak, although all the paradigm, or almost all of them, may vary. So again, we're coming to the issue of sin. One of the first testimonies we focus is on from whatever is this word, by Michael Beim, who lived in 15th century. It illustrates the danger of ill-considered words reminiscent of the biblical admonition, "You shall not take the name of the Lord in vain." So this is the story. One fine day, Count Eberhard of Württemberg went by himself to hunt in the forest. He soon heard a loud uproar and saw an alarming creature appearing in pursuit of a stag. In terror, he fell to the ground and sought refuge in a copse, COPSE. When he asked the apparition if he intended to do him harm, the unknown figure answered, "No, I'm a man like you. I was once a lord who was passionately fond of hunting, and one day I asked God if he would permit me to hunt until Judgment Day. To my great misfortune, my wish was granted, and it was already been 500 years that I have hunted this single stag." I don't buy this story to be true at all. I mean, this doesn't represent God's attribute or the way God, behaves, but whatever. Uh, so then the peasant, Eberhard, asked him, "Show me your face that I might possibly recognize you." The other uncovered his face. It was the size of a fist and as wrinkled as dry as a dead leaf. He then rode off in pursuit of the stag. That's the end of the story. Again, I don't buy it for a second. This story occupies its own place in the corpus of the accursed hunter. The hunter is punished for hunting on Sunday. This is very legalistic. Another reason why I don't believe this story to be true at all. So the hunter is punished for hunting on Sunday, for damaging crops, for slaying a stag in a church. Okay, I don't know about the last part. That seems sacrilegious. But yeah, for hunting on the Lord's Day, it's not a sin. So yeah. His passion for hunting is punished and condemns him to the eternal hunt without any break or rest until the day of the last judgment. This type of legend was extremely popular, and Paul Sebelot has collected a large number of them. And he says, "The noises of the whoever are the baying of the pack of the hunter who was cursed for hunting during holy services and profaning the Sabbath." How is he profaning the Sabbath if he was hunting on Sunday? Dude, this was bad theology. "Now he's condemned by God to hunt through the night without cease. Also heard are the sounds of riders and trumpet calls." I don't like this part because it's super legalistic. Then there are more stories of similar events happening with slightly different elements of the story. And again, as the author says, there's this repetitive theme of the sin. So the last type of this wild hunter, who's called the curse hunter, he comes there to chase people who are like sinning or something that is relatable to the sin. So he says, yeah, the theme of the curse hunter is not limited to stories about damned huntsmen. Hunting, which in fact represents a perpetual wandering and the repetition of one act, has also been since the Middle Ages the punishment for other sins. In the vision of Thurkill, Thurkill, written at the beginning of the 13th century and sometimes attributed to Ralph or whatever place, we see a theater on the stage of which sinners regularly repeat their sins, a performance which the devils would not miss for the whole world. Then we have story of the King Arthur and some elements that supposedly we didn't know, how he wasn't all that good and pious and perfect. Then there's a segment from sinner to hunter, and this is the concluding part. The legends of the diabolical huntsman, which was the first theory, second, the wild huntsman, and this last one, the curse hunter, form a complete set, I would say unholy trinity, for which we can sketch an outline of specific time categories. Originally, we find a supernatural being, an ogre or giant, in pursuit of another fantasy creature, a lady of the woods, a fairy who has been promised to him. Because she refuses his suit, he wishes to kill and devour her. Philip Walter has shown that the supernatural being was a composite mythical creature, a goddess of the dead or psychopomp, connected to the rooster or the chicken and to the dog. This sets off the debate again about the name of the leader of the wild hunt, which hopefully we'll cover next Friday, and suggests that Herla component is not original. Instead, it is likely a fabrication of Walter Map or his source, the invention of a mythical king of the ancient Bretons, introduced into the story to give into some historical belief. The leader of the wild hunt was undoubtedly the avatar of an ancient ambivalent deity who presided over death and resurrection, exactly like the Celtic Dagda, who killed men with one end of his staff and resurrected them with the other, and whose attributes included a rooster and a dog, which symbolically reflected his dual function. This deity likely provided the name Hanekin. Then we have more stories and more connections in this concluding part. Um, Predicated on the mythological canvas and adopting the image of the devil slash hunter, the ancient deity was demonized and transformed into a demon pursuing a soul in punishment, that of a sinner. We should recall that the image of Satan as hunter was established in the 4th century in opposition to the figure of the sinner, which smacks of Christian representations. Again, the author is very upset with Christians. Early on, St. Augustine called the devil the worst hunter in the entire universe. Yet the devil does hunt in the conventional fashion, which would correspond to the civilization of the earliest testimonies describing him as the hunter. Okay, there are more details here because I want to conclude within 5 to 10 minutes the episodes. I don't want to read this. I'm just trying to see what will be important for the concluding section. We can easily identify each group of this corpus, so all these 3 theories, centered on the notion of hunting, for each is characterized by one or more specific and recurring elements. In the case of the diabolical huntsman, this element was the active intervention of a living individual who attempted to save the hunted person and then failed, and then saw the devil carrying off his prey, which he tossed across his saddle. In that of the wild huntsman, the nature of the protagonist, first and foremost, distinguishes this group of stories from the others. Another distinguishing element is the motive of a share in the hunt. And in the case of the last one, the cursed hunter, the explanation provided by the dead person transforms the narrative into a pedagogical exemplum. We can note one constant: the appearance most often takes place in a forest. And this is the last part, and I think this is very scholarly and very good. In general, not about this, the wild hunt. Stories are not fossils. They permanently combine and evolve. They are reworked in accordance with the literary genres, and they adapt them and become harder and harder to classify. Starting from the 15th or 16th century, we can note fusions and contamination, and only the indexing and analysis of medieval testimonies make it possible to track down the corpus of legends collected in the 19th century. Yeah, that was a great quotation. But basically, Shaun, when it comes to these 3 versions of the leader of the wild hunt and the way he or it was portrayed, we'll see different instances. Sometimes it will be, a spiritual being or a deity or an ogre. Sometimes it will be hunting a sinner. Sometimes it will be hunting another spiritual beings, bad boys, right? But all in all, I don't think from all of these 3 theories, all of these versions of the leader of the wild hunt, we cannot say that this first has any root in biblical text. And also, I don't think we can conclude that any of these stories, events, if they're rooted in anything that happened historically, we cannot say that any of these things would be something that God would be orchestrating, that they'll be good. Even, I would dare to say, even that part where the medieval monks and priests would be trying to scare their congregants and say, hey, this wild huntsman may be here checking the sinners, you better repent. I mean, I understand that you want to warn people, but not to the point of inventing fantasy tales that, or the stories that already exist, but switch them and alter them to a point like, oh, God is sending these supernatural entities, so you have to repent unless they will come for your souls. I didn't like that part where medieval monks were inventing that. So again, we're called to speak the truth. If in other parts I disagree with the author, Claude Lecoultre, in this part I would agree with him. Like, if the clergy was inventing or adding on these stories to scare the flock, I don't like. What is your concluding thought when it comes to this leader of the wild hunt and 3 of these theories that he or it was portrayed?
Yeah, I think that these are didactic stories that were created by the church in order to explain the customs that the people at the time were bound by. Whether or not we like them, I think is really immaterial, because they were expressions of the world that these people lived in. So, for example, the wild hunter who hunts down the man who is living in unrepentant sin. Um, it it is not true that there is literally a hunter out there that is trying to hunt you down and has dogs that are chasing you. However, it is true that death will come for every man. And so the idea that you should repent because your time is limited and there is one out there who is going to get you, and that's death, um, that's very true. The idea of the wild hunter who's out hunting the supernatural creatures. This really reminds me um, of kind of a mixture between Pan, who was always pursuing the nymphs. And so you would always see this kind of procession of him chasing the nymphs around and playing music for them. And the hunter from the Celtic lands, I think his name was Cernunnos, and he was represented by dogs and snakes. So not necessarily the rooster part, but dogs and snakes. And so I think that maybe that kind of imagery was being pulled on here. The idea that they were trying to explain is that the wooded areas, the wild areas, just as what we see in the scripture, these are the areas that are not yet claimed for the Lord. These are wild. There are still spiritual entities that subsist in these places, and it's interesting that of all the phenomena that we've encountered, a lot of it has to do with the forest, and it's because these were the areas that people were not really living and claiming for Christ. And then third, the idea of the cursed hunter. Again, I think this is just a didactic story. We do see in scripture the guy who was told on the Sabbath, don't be going out and collecting sticks. He went out and collected sticks, and Moses is like, okay, so God, what do we do with him? Oh, kill him? Okay, we kill him. Um, so there is biblical precedent for this. Also, the Sabbath was very strictly enforced during the Middle Ages. So the idea that, hey, you can't be working or doing anything that doesn't pertain to church activities on the Sabbath, there's truth in that. Also, we also have to remember that, especially in Northern Europe, that the wildlife belonged to the king. It wasn't fair game to just go out and hunt anything you wanted, because that was the king's. The forest was the king's. So you're going to go out and hunt and kill something. Um, that would be punishable by death, because you're killing the king's fauna. And third, the killing of something inside the church. This is at a time where we have to remember that the church represented sanctuary. And so if even a criminal were to flee to the church, the authorities could not pursue him into the church, because the church represented sanctuary. So an animal that was standing in the church, that would have been evidence that the animal was asking for sanctuary. So I'm not saying that the story actually happened, but you take all these little threads of the world that these people lived in, and then you combine them together, and you can get this story that would really speak to people, would resonate with people. They would understand it. It wouldn't be as I don't want to say that they could have accepted it as true, because I don't think that that's the point. Just like when you talk about like a boogeyman that's going to come and get you if you're out after dark, the kids might believe it, but you don't have any belief in that. But what you're trying to tell them is bad things happen, scary things happen, and it's dangerous to be out after dark, so you need to be inside. I think that's more representative of the feel that I get from these stories. So I'm with you. I don't think that they're necessarily real or representative of anything true, in a sense that they actually happened. But as far as didactic stories, I think they serve their purpose well, and they were informed by the people who lived in that time, and they actually informed people who were living at the time about the customs and the culture in which they live. And so in that sense, they're useful. And that kind of goes along with all the other stories that we dealt with. Either the church kept the stories and changed them in order to communicate something that was true, or they would eliminate stories, or they would fabricate stories that would communicate something. And we do that today when we're using analogies. We fabricate something in order to be able to better explain a truth. And so I think that they were in the business of doing that. We do that with our movies, and we do that with our novels. So this is just part of the storytelling history of humanity. It's what we do. We communicate important details through fiction, and so I think that it is a beautiful testimony to the creative and intelligent and wise people who lived in the past, who are trying to understand their world around them. And so we carry on that heritage to this day.
Thank you for that. I have a very ungrateful question for you. I also want to say I'm sorry for everyone for butchering so many French and German names as well as locations. I never heard of, you know, I never heard when it comes to most of these names. So, yeah, sorry for butchering them. I would just again recommend buying the book. I provided the Amazon link of the book, and I saw yesterday it's actually cheaper than what I bought it for. So, and actually, I have several books from the same author because he's very scholarly, and he, as a historian and former professor, he dabbles with so many supernatural topics in a scholarly way, not to portray them as true or not. He's just trying to get to the core of these stories and events. But I have a very tough and ungrateful question for you, Shaun. So this book, as the phantom armies in the night and as the wild hunt and its leader, whoever he or it was and is, this was happening for centuries in Europe. How come we don't have this anymore? We now have UFOs, we have Bigfoot, we have Mothman, we have Dogman, and not everything that modern man is witnessing, if it's true in the supernatural realm, is the same that people in medieval ages or before them were witnessing. Some of them, yes, but most of them are way different. If this was again happening throughout the continent, and it was happening to so many eyewitnesses in so many towns, cities, villages, and countries throughout Europe, how come we don't see this? It doesn't even have to be specifically a phantom or wild hunt, but how come we don't see these slain warriors or any apparitions and phantoms fighting in the sky as omens, or maybe this time loop of a battle happening before and now we see like a replay in the sky? How come? Because we as modern men, me included, we always want some firm evidence. We always want, and of course, I know it will be impossible to record it and have it. But like, how come we don't see this? It's the same universe. It's the same structure of the universe. It's still very supernatural as much as it's, visible. It's the same God. It's the same shadows in the night, the same demonic principalities, the same fallen gods. True, God may bring an end to certain things, and then new apparitions, new abominations may occur. So I can understand that this was for the time being of few centuries in a certain part of a certain continent. But I'm just intrigued, how come in 20th and 21st century, anything that, like, we don't hear stuff like that. We hear, maybe people saw a UFO, maybe they saw something in the forest, national park. We covered, Skinwalker Ranch. We covered one episode of the 411 missing cases in natural forest, fine. But when it comes to something like this, massive troops or massive hordes of former warriors, men and women, guided by gods and goddesses or supernatural entities at their head, fighting with someone else in the sky as omens or as like I said, time loops of previous fights. We're not seeing anything remotely similar, unless I'm mistaken. I don't go out there and check videos or articles of everything supernatural happening in the world. I'm not doing that. I don't have time or energy for that. But my question, of course, we don't know the answer. But what would be your best explanation of how come we don't witness similar things, maybe not the same things, but similar things nowadays. If this was happening for a long time, the question must be coming from someone like me who's like Mulder. I want to believe, but it's like there's nothing remotely similar to that. There are different things, but not like this anymore. Can we maybe tackle the why?
Yeah. So my hypothesis would be that the reason we don't see those things is because we don't see those things. And what I mean by that is we don't see the supernatural equivalent of the wild hunter or the armies fighting or those kinds of things because we don't see the natural equivalent of them, right? It's not just commonplace to have a dude that's out hunting. Normally you go and you drive to the place that you're going to hunt. You go off into the woods. There's a small contingent of people that do that and interact with that, and they may have hunter stories, but the general population are kind of isolated from that. As far as people who are fighting, we don't really see battles here. We could see them online, but that's something that happens over there. That's not something that happens here. So it's not something that we would normally see. The things that we do now see are things that are more common, more prevalent with us. We have lots of cases of people seeing, supernatural apparitions of vehicles on the road that are driving and then they just disappear. Why? Because that's part of our normal experience. So when we see that, okay, so that's something that's weird. The woman in white who stands by the side of the road and is a hitchhiker trying to get somewhere and then just disappears in the car seat. Because this is part of our everyday experience, we are seeing these things. So I think that the supernatural is just as much a product of our society, at least in the form that it takes, as it informs our society. And so I don't think we see those things because they're not normative anymore. But the things that are normative for us is where we're seeing the supernatural occur. And so those things were not happening then, but they're happening now, at least according to the attestation of hundreds, if not thousands, of people who have encountered these kinds of things. So that would be my explanation, that they are not something that is meaningful to us anymore. So we're not going to encounter the supernatural in that way.
That was the most epic ending that we had in a while. So wise, and so informative and so correct that we should take these things in their own context, as always, just as we do the same thing with the Bible. That being said, thank you everyone for bearing with us for 2.5 hours. Sorry for some technical issues. Sorry for the delays. These things happen. So it is what it is. I will just kindly remind everyone to like, subscribe, and keep sharing our material. It doesn't cost you anything and actually may help with the algorithm. And also, Ember will be coming this Sunday, where we'll be talking about the oldest found Bible by German scholar Konstantin von Tischendorf 2 centuries ago, when he was not minding his business but visiting St. Catherine's monastery in Africa and finding, by people say by coincidence, but I would say by God's providence, one of the oldest Bibles we have today in its all length, plus 2 extra books of the Bible. And I don't know if that in that story the monks were also supposed to burn that Bible because they were ignorant of what they had and they needed more material for the stone, right, to keep the fire going on. Yet he preserved the Bible, moved it to Europe, and because of him we have this Codex Sinaiticus, which is with Codex Vaticanus the oldest Bible we have to this day. It's such a marvelous work of history and archaeology, and I applaud God for using this scholar who was a modern Indiana Jones in preserving that Bible. So because of him, we have it today, and we can actually go and see images online and read, the Koine Greek text in which the Codex was written. That being said, we'll see you in 2 days. Hopefully next Friday, Shaun and I, and maybe Pastor Ben, will be back to continue the ending of this book. And because we have, as I was talking to Shaun, I have hundreds of books with these topics and different topics behind me. You can't even see everything on the shelf that I bought in the last 10 years, and I don't have time to read and assess and comment on. But because I take podcasts almost to be like a school, I give myself deadlines. I'm like, okay, but this episode, by this day, we have to finish this book so we can assess it. So now I give myself homework so I can finally read the books. I'm like, why did I invest all the money on all these books? So with Shaun and occasionally Pastor Ben, I hope he's not watching this. We can hopefully assess many of these books in the months and years to come. So if you have some special ideas, special desires, recommendations for the topics or books, and if we have them, you can always send us a comment either live or when we go off, and you can still comment on the YouTube channel. But yeah, please continue subscribing, liking, sharing the content of our YouTube channel. Everything is completely free. There is still no VIP section or something like that. Everything that you see there, it's free for everyone. God bless you. See you in 2 days and then in the 5 days to come. Take care.